My name is Philip Munoz. I'm in the Department of Political Science and at the Law School here at Notre Dame. And it's my great pleasure to bring this morning's speaker, one of the highlights of this weekend's conference. Tristram Engelhardt has a PhD and an MD. I'm sure he's known to many of you already. Professor in the Department of Philosophy at Rice University and Professor Emeritus at the Baylor College of Medicine. Senior editor of Christian Bioethics at the Journal of Medicine and Philosophy and the Philosophy of Medicine book series. Numerous publications in bioethics, philosophy, a great mind, a wide-ranging thinker. A man I've never met before, so I'm quite interested in hearing what he has to say this morning. The title of his talk is A Condition of Greater Simplicity Beyond the Value Discourse of Human Dignity and Human Rights. And it's my great pleasure to present to you Tristram Engelhardt.
It is a joy to be here. There was a Texas senator who once was voting for a bill, and someone of poor moral disposition said, "You can't vote for that because that's a conflict of interest." He said, "How can it be a conflict of interest? It is in my interest." So let me start off and unabashedly first advertise Christian bioethics. No one should leave this room alive without getting a subscription. Mr. Cherry, Professor Cherry, wave your hands. Sir, can you close the door? I know there's a bit noise coming. So please do subscribe. See him there? And also I've been asked, and this shows what friendship I show to other journals, Touchstone. Subscribe. Let me begin first to tell you what I hope to talk about today. I'm going to review the points because perhaps as you've noticed, English is not my first language. Ich rede doch Deutsch. Texan is my second language. And so I will attempt to deliver the presentation, though, in the governor's English. The man in the back, when we have questions, he should stop making any recording of the questions. I can probably take out the camera from this distance. What I'm going to talk about is our condition after Christendom. I want in part to sketch what I take to be a wide-ranging change in Western culture. For over 1,700 years, we have lived off of the inheritance of St. Constantine the Great, who died in 337, and St. Justinian the Great, who died in 565. What I mean by that is they created a normative Christian polity in the West that has fallen into decrepitude and chaos over time. So when I talk about us living after Christendom, I mean we are living after the last remnants of what St. Constantine the Great established and what St. Justinian the Great established, two holy emperors. I will have in the background a number of points of criticism. One, I will be making an argument that has been advanced by people such as Gianni Vattimo, who is a contemporary European thinker and a representative in the European Congress, which rules Mr. Billiot there. But he points out that the secular culture in which we live, welcome back, is really an outgrowth of Western Christianity. He wants to say how we think about in secular terms now, how we live in a secular culture, is the direct result of Western Christianity. And what they have in mind was the marriage of faith and reason that made Roman Catholicism as a distinct religion in the beginning of the second millennium. If you have read how people thought in the first 400 years, they recognize God as totally incomprehensible. As Evagrius of Pontus says, that God exists, I do not exist. There's no analogy of being lived for an absolutely transcendent God. The remarkable thing that Western Christianity was built on was the claim that reason could comprehend the incomprehensible God. Of course, once you did that, you did two things. One, you tamed God, but you also put philosophers in the very middle of all reflections. It was one of the most bold make-work jobs for philosophers, because if philosophers were right in their argument that one could, in fact, chain incomprehensible God within the canons of philosophy, then morality would be reducible to reason. We philosophers would be the arbiters of what is rational. We would be the source of the authority of polities. And even if you thought you didn't belong to what the European community wants to have, a faceless community where everyone is bound together in human dignity, equality, liberty, and human rights, wouldn't be possible, because people would have different communities and different visions. We philosophers, we would be the arbiters. So what I'm going to be talking about in part is how our contemporary society is the outcome of this marriage of faith and reason, which marriage of faith and reason goes aground on the 30 Years' War, 1618 to 1648, in which over 30% of the people in Germany were killed in the hostilities during the Civil War, not the late unpleasantness, between 1642 and 1649, when King Charles Martel is decapitated. What happens after that? People turn away from the marriage of faith and reason and embrace reason alone. To bring that across, the lecture has not yet begun. This is just a spiel beforehand to make sure everyone gets in through the front door who wants to. You're going to see the change in how one would think about things. In the inadequate introduction given, Professor Munoz didn't mention I used to be a deputy sheriff. But you can get across the change of what takes place by imagining, not you here, but let's see the people in the other lecture hall, going down to a bar and getting wildly drunk. And the sheriff sends me in to hush them up. And let's imagine that they're drunk in 1276, after the death of Thomas Aquinas on the way to the Second Council of Lyon of most impious memory. So they're drunk there, and the sheriff sends in the deputy sheriff. I say, hush up, y'all. And you say to the deputy sheriff, by what authority are you telling me to hush up? I said, well, you just stereotyped me. I got a PhD in philosophy from the University of Paris, couldn't get a job, so I went into police work to make money. But pick out y'all's Bibles, turn to Romans 13th chapter, 1st to the 4th verse, and you will say that the man who carries the gladium sword does not carry it in vain, but all authority comes from God. You say, heavy. I say, whoa. I also studied under this Thomas Aquinas, read his commentaries on Aristotle's Politics. I'm going to tell you all about what a rector ratio is, and how that leads to a rector ratio agibilis, and with a community and subsidiarity and everything, you'll understand I'm just the guy who will allow you to have rector ratio agibilis. You say, hey, I'm shutting up. Okay, same people over there, they're drunk as skunks again, but it's 1690. Remember, the Civil War, not the late unpleasantness, 1642 to the decapitation of King Charles Martyr. You've gotten over that, but the people, that's after that. It's 1690. The Great Glorious Bloodless Revolution of England in 1688. The Bill of Rights of 1689. William and Mary have come in 1690, and the British have decided to live peaceful with each other, just through imperialism, conquer the world, and have markets and get rich. The people are drunk again. I walk in, I said, hush up, y'all. And you said, by what authority? Now, if I pull out the Bible, Anglicans will get after the Presbyterians will get after Anglicans, both of them will get after Roman Catholics and the Jews. It'll just be terrible. So I'm not going to mention the Bible. I'm going to say, let me explain things to you. I went to Oxford with John Locke. We both studied philosophy, couldn't make any money in it. He went into medicine to make money. I went into piecework. But let me walk you through the second treatise on government, and you'll understand the role of the state in being able to adjudicate so as to protect life and property. You say, heavy, shut up. Now, that brings us to the Enlightenment. I'm sure in grammar school you were told to remember the Enlightenment, something like 1689 with the Bill of Rights to 1789 with the French Revolution. People thought that reason could substitute for God. There'd be one reason. I mean, that's still the passion of the European Union. He was pointing out yesterday how scared the European Union is that there might be Romanian saints, because that challenges this claim to just absolute blank universality of the European Union. It's still this Enlightenment hope. And of course, once you get to the French Revolution, you come to value liberty, equality, human dignity, and human rights. Okay, the people are drunk as skunks again, and it's 2010, and they're in the postmodern honky-tonk. The sheriff sends me in, and people are doing all kinds of disgusting things to each other. And I say, excuse me, everybody consent to what's going on, treat everybody else as an equal person, recognizing their human dignity and human rights. I said, yeah, okay, I'm leaving. Okay, so what one sees is, in the end, the traditional morality is deflated. And instead, there's side constraints. As long as you give lip service to liberty, equality, human dignity, and human rights, you can do what you want. So what I'm going to do is look at that issue in this presentation when I finally get through with the preface. By the way, you will not have problems getting a seat. The two similarities that everybody know between me and Castro, we both have beards, and we both like to talk 3 hours, so when we get down at 1 o'clock, there'll be plenty of seats. So I'm going to talk about this deflation and the character of the secular space that develops once we've lost the inheritance from St. Constantine the Great and St. Justinian the Great. Once we've gone through this European hope that everyone will just be one equal, free, humanly dignified human rights bearer. The other issue is one has to look at the secular space as if God did not exist. Jürgen Habermas picks out that after Hegel, the atheist methodological postulate becomes a cornerstone of the society. Not only is traditional morality deflated, but everyone is enjoined to look at the world as if it all came from nowhere, was going nowhere, and from no discernible ultimate purpose. So it's a radical change in the framing condition. And so the question is, what do we Christians do now, if you happen to be a Christian, and I'm an Orthodox Christian, in this post-Christian culture? How do we respond? And so I will at the end suggest one way people try to respond, which I will criticize. And that is what is referred to in German as Wertkonservatismus, values discourse. People say, well, we can at least agree on values together. So even though we may not agree what the answer is, who do you say Jesus is, we'll all agree about values. Now, of course, if you think about that just a little bit, you know that is crazy. Think about Singapore, which is probably one of my favorite countries in the world. If you were going to compare countries, and you're comparing them in terms of liberty, equality, prosperity, and security, if you're up in the Soviet Kyrgyzstan, they give prior value to liberty and equality. It's a Rawlsian paradise. If you're in Singapore, you know the first thing you want to do is be safe. The second thing you want to be rich. Who cares about that much liberty if you're secure and rich and forget about equality? It depends on how you rank the values. And unless you have a God's eye perspective, there's no final ranking of the values. So you can see the whole discourse about human dignity, human rights is on a collision course. It's sawed off of the branch on which it is sitting, and value discourse can't work. So value discourse can't work with people who want to have it, but also it can't be the way Christians will talk about what is the answer. That's the point of simplicity. The simple and most provocative answer of what we do is we ask the question, who do you say Jesus is? And you answer in public, the Messiah of Israel, the Son of the living God. So that's the whole presentation. Now we're about to have the boring paper read. Any questions? You all can understand my text? Okay. This conference is centered around the proposal that humility, wonder, joy undergird flourishing in this world and lead in grace to happiness in the next. This presentation is a response to that invitation and to a dominant culture quite alien from the virtues to which the call for papers speaks. Confronted with a cacophony of a postmodern, post-traditional culture, this presentation points to the simplicity at the core of authentic Christian theology. This theological simplicity is its vis a tergo, the vis a fronte. The vis a tergo, that against which this presentation reacts, is the cacophony and controversies that mark our contemporary culture. The presentation begins with a foundational background assumption, for which I have argued elsewhere, namely that absent a God's eye perspective, the nature of morality is radically recast. The nature of morality fragments in its content into a diversity of moralities that characterize our postmodern condition. Second, as a consequence of this fragmentation and the concurrent influence of the Enlightenment transformed by the French Revolution, Christian moral concerns are relocated in terms of the cardinal Enlightenment commitments to liberty, equality, human dignity, and human rights. Third, this state of affairs has the further consequence that the content of traditional Christian morality is deflated. Much of this is appreciated by Hegel already in 1802 when he publishes his Glauben und Wissen, who understood that he lived in an age within which the Christianities of Western Europe were in the process of being radically transformed. Hegel saw what Gianni Vattimo would later affirm, namely that Western Christianity, by integrating into itself the pagan philosophies of Plato, Aristotle, and the Stoics, recast Western Christianity itself, and finally produced from that synthesis the contemporary dominant secular moral cultural perspective. As Vattimo says, here comes the quote, "To embrace the destiny of modernity and of the West means mainly to recognize the profoundly Christian meaning of secularization. I return to the observation, namely that the lay space of modern liberalism is far more religious than liberalism and Christianity are willing to recognize. Western Christianity's vocation consists in deepening its own physiognomy as source and condition for the possibility of secularity." What Vattimo is saying, the very marriage of faith and reason brought in the genes from reason, which always had to displace the radically personal character of the persons of the Trinity and of Christ, and create a set of arguments independent from faith, which then became the backbone of secular culture itself, which is now marginalizing Christianity. Vattimo appreciates that the secular post-Christian, indeed anti-traditional Christian culture, is in fact the final fruit of what Western Christianity was. This is a position not just affirmed by post-Christians, but by many mainline Christians as well. One might consider, for example, Peter Dabruch's argument, a German theologian, quote, "A Christian ethics, especially from a European Protestant perspective, tends to converge with the general tradition of human rights and with the constitutions framing Europe's legal and social democracies. The internal theological concept of man as the image of God and of his justification through faith provides a foundation with reference to which the axiom of human dignity and the idea of self-determination appear as a transition to that concept in the language of public reason. Because of the continuities between the dominant secular culture and the Christianity that developed in the West in the beginning of the second millennium, the radical changes over the last few decades may not appear as dramatic as they in fact are. Across the rupture, there is a continuity between the contemporary secular affirmations of liberty, equality, human dignity, and human rights, and the natural law tradition that shaped and recast and created Western Christianity. Something new has emerged, a transformation of the morality of Western Christianity set free of its fides. This gulf between traditional Christians and the now dominant secular culture, it should be recognized, has ancient roots. The gulf between the emerging secular culture and the right-believing and right-worshipping Christians began to open already before Christ in how one thought about the relationship of morality to God, especially as it's articulated in the argument in Plato's Euthyphro, where the choice is offered between holding that God approves of the good because it is good, or that the good is good because God approves it. The second response is that exemplified by Orthodox Christians. Orthodox Christianity recognized in the Christianity of the first millennium that the good, the right, and the virtuous cannot be understood rightly apart from the holy, which is personal, who is God. The first option offered by the Euthyphro is the framework embraced by value conservativists who hold that one can get it right about values without getting it right about God. The discourse that Plato affirms in the Euthyphro became core to both the reflections of medieval natural law accounts and that of the subsequent secularity of the West. The discourse that Plato rejects in the Euthyphro is the discourse of right-believing, right-worshipping Christians, which recognizes one can't get values rightly without getting God rightly. The Euthyphro's God of value discourse, which became the God of the Christianity of the West as it emerged in the early second millennium, brings David Bradshaw in his wonderful book published at Cambridge University Press, I think in 2002, Aristotle, East and West. He brings Bradshaw to ask the question, quote, whether the God who has been the subject of so much strife and contention throughout Western history was anything more than an idol. It made it possible, this shift, for the Western Enlightenment to believe it could recast the God of the West and his morality through the power of ratio, reason. A considerable gulf, as a consequence, separates right-believing, right-worshipping Christians from the now dominant post-Christian, post-traditional, and postmodern secular culture. The starkness of the separation is augmented by the character of the secularity. The secular culture that emerged from the Western European Enlightenment through the French Revolution is shaped, as I pointed out, by an atheist, not merely agnostic methodological postulate. That is, the culture, rather than being neutral to the existence or non-existence of God, is framed actively as if God did not exist. The result is that religious beliefs must be marginalized so as to become affirmatively matters of private belief, not matters that should structure the public forum. Yet, if one knows that God exists, then one knows that all is structured by his will, including the public forum. The global result is that there is a profound gulf between those who act knowing that God exists and that the world comes from his creative act and is going through the incarnation to final transformation versus those who approach reality as if all came from nowhere, were going nowhere, and for no apparent ultimate purpose. The gulf is between those who live towards ultimate meaninglessness and those who live in the face of ultimate meaning. Everything, again, turns on the simplicity of the question for Christians, who is Christ? And the subsequent question, who is his church? We live after Christendom. The non-dominant culture of the West took shape as the result, as I pointed out, of a fundamental rupture in morality and metaphysical understanding that severed the moral commitments this culture had created and taken from traditional Christian commitments to the incomprehensible God who lives and who commands. This rupture separates our dominant culture from the Christendom established by Constantine the Great and Justinian the Great. Although the changes are far-reaching indeed, as I pointed out, they are also paradoxically difficult for many in the contemporary culture to appreciate because many of the moral commitments that deform, deflate, and marginalize traditional Christian commitments are rooted in the intellectual synthesis that created Western Christianity. So there is, as Vattimo points out and Dalbrook sees, a real continuity. It seems strange to many Christians of our culture that the dominant commitments to liberty, equality, human dignity, social justice, and human rights gain their intention and extension from a post-Christian worldview. Moreover, it is difficult, given the now dominant ideology, to recognize how long remnants of the past survive with the commitments to the previous culture. For those who are old, they will recognize what I'm about to talk about. For even only 70 years ago, Christianity was still de facto, if not de jure, the established religion of the Americas and of Western Europe. It was not the case that there was separation of church and state. There was no such, surely there was no particular federally established Christian denomination. But in each of the states, Christianity was nevertheless established. All that has changed, and with profound consequences for the public, that leads to why you do away with creches and the Ten Commandments in courtrooms. All that change, though, is a rather radically recent one. To bring that across for those who are younger than I, when dinosaurs still walked the earth, I was charged with delivering babies at Charity Hospital in New Orleans. The state hospital system of Louisiana paid totally through state funds. It was run by the Sisters of Charity. When I came into the obstetrics department to deliver babies, the Sister of Charity came up and said, "Doctors, I don't care if you're an atheist or Jew or Protestant or Mormon. If you deliver a baby and that baby looks like it's going to die, you're going to give it a Roman Catholic baptism. This is what you use or you're out of this program." Well, no one breathed that there was anything unconstitutional about it, because again, read the First Amendment to the compact style, the Constitution of the United States. It says the Congress shall make no law. That's the federal Congress. They didn't have to do it. Louisiana did it. So we live just in our lifetime in that close to this dramatic change. Not all countries have fully gone through that change yet. Germany, for example, there's a Lutheran healthcare system where no physician, nurse, orderly, anyone can practice there who's not a Christian, and they've got a definition of who's a Christian. The contemporary dominant American European culture began to gain salience in the late 18th and 19th century as it took on laicist commitments that affirmed liberty, equality, social justice, and social progress, nested within a humanist vision set within a recognition of Christendom having ended. A force of various secularizations, such as Josephism under Emperor Joseph II of Austria, who ruled from 1769 to 1790, and particularly the force of the Reichsdeputationshauptschluss of the 24th of August 1802 and the secularization in Central Europe inaugurated 1803, along with the reforms of Napoleon, engendered an ever more secular public space. Within the vanguard of that time's culture, as Hegel appreciated, God was dead. He's the first person to use God is dead in the Glauben and Wissen article he published in 1802. Hegel then resurrected God and religion as an immanently transcendent, immanentized transcendent, that is, a cultural good, compassed within the self-reflective stewardship of philosophy. Again, we philosophers are central. Mr. knows that for Hegel, it is we philosophers who are God. We'll tell you what you ought to be. If there's no God's perspective, it's only our perspective, because we're the final rational perspective. Nice to be God. As such, religion became no longer practices and commitments aimed at a transcendent God. Instead, religion became an element of human cultural heritage, a Kulturgut, transformed so as to be compatible with the secular culture of modernity. In the spirit of this transformation, one does not talk about what one knows theologically, but of what is affirmed in one's tradition. One finds Western Christians saying, in the Methodist tradition, we believe. Imagine if you did that in any area that people took seriously. Imagine me coming up to you, sir, and saying, in my medical tradition, you have congestive heart failure. You'd think I was crazy. But the idea is to deconstruct, deflate not only morality, but theological statements. The now dominant culture no longer invokes a recognition of God who commands. It is within this now dominant culture that the moral commitments of the European Union, the United States, as well as most of the other polities of Europe and the Americas are now located and understood. This state of affairs marks the realization and establishment of a post-Christian culture, which has deflated major dimensions of traditional Christian moral concerns. As a point of illustration, this secular culture has recast the morality of sexuality, reproduction, and death in substantively post-Christian, post-traditional terms. Western Europe and North America have embraced the project of regarding what it is to have sex, have children, suffer and face death as if the universe came from nowhere, were going nowhere, and for no discernible ultimate purpose. As T.S. Eliot, in his poem, Fragment of Agon, says, birth, copulation, and death. Those are all the facts when you get down to brass tacks. Birth, copulation, and death. Here again, how one regards birth, copulation, and death, sexuality, reproduction, suffering, and death, frames the ways in which most people see their lives. How they make love, how they reproduce, how they shape and experience their life world, and think about death. All of that has been deflated to a matter of personal choice. Remember coming into the postmodern honky-tonk, where all the sheriff asks, is anybody doing anything to anybody else without recognizing them as free, equal people with human dignity and human rights? They say, no, okay, go ahead. It is no merely innocent issue that fornication and concubinage have again become accepted as they were in the ancient pagan world, such that parents, without blushing, speak in public of their daughters living with boyfriends in a fashion that would have been highly unimaginable 3/4 of a century ago. One can likely not understand the implications of these changes without seeing the background shift of the framework that itself collapsed. The change in sexual morality, for example, is tied to other wide-ranging foundational moral changes, such that abortion has come to be regarded as a basic and fundamental human right. This right to abortion is passionately embraced because it affirms an insurance policy that supports the now dominant lifestyle in which women postpone marriage until their mid or late 30s, that is, they don't want to get married till their senior partners in Dewey, Cheatham, and Howe are nasty, brutish, and short. But it's hard to remain a virgin, especially in the law firm of Dewey, Cheatham, and Howe, until you finally marry at the age of 36. This not only exposes them to risks of pregnancy, for which abortion, therefore, is so central, but also it means that when they finally get around to marrying at the age of 37, and if they're still able to have children, they're exposed to a much higher risk of having children with serious birth defects. So abortion becomes central to the immense recasting of human sexuality at the end of the 20th and the beginning of the 21st century. In all of this, the horizon of relevance has retreated from the infinite and the transcendent to the horizon of the finite and the immanent, within which there are no defining ontological boundaries such as those that sustain the traditional Christian gender essentialist borders that distinguish men from women, with the consequence that being male or female becomes regarded as a social construction. Once that happens, though, this also recasts the status of heterosexual and homosexual activities. Movements to accept homosexual activity on a par with heterosexual activity, and then to establish heterosexual marriages on a par with traditional homosexual marriage on a par with traditional heterosexual marriage, marks further this dimension of the deflation of ontological and moral difference. Once one part of it collapses, all of it collapses. So when I walk in to the postmodern honky-tonk, I just ask them, are you all adults freely consenting, respecting each other's equality, human dignity, and human rights? They say yes, I walk out. So too, it's tied to the choices regarding end-of-life decisions from Oregon to the Netherlands and Belgium and elsewhere. Physician-assisted suicide and euthanasia are becoming widely embraced because one can no longer see how to forbid them by appealing to liberty, equality, human dignity, and human rights. A new way of thinking about and engaging in sexuality, reproduction, dying, and death has taken central stage. A radically new and postmodern life world has become dominant, so much so that to speak critically regarding its character is usually to offend the foundations of contemporary political correctness. The sheriff must not even snicker when he walks out of the honky-tonk. In this period of de-christianization, the Western Christianities are at the same time also in disarray and decline. It is for this reason that John Paul II observed already in 1993, and I quote, "The de-Christianization weighs heavily on entire peoples and communities once rich in faith and Christian life. It involves not only the loss of faith, in any event it's becoming irrelevant, but also of necessity a decline and obscuring of the moral sense." What John Paul II is describing is this immense de-Christianization of Western Europe. I'm an old man. Within my own lifetime of visiting Europe first in 1954, I was 13. And since then to the present, I've experienced the dramatic retreat of Western Christianity. My first encounters with Italy in 1950 were rich with experiences of Roman Catholic priests and friars in the streets, and Roman Catholics actually in the churches. The churches of Switzerland, Austria, and Germany, even the Protestant churches, had numerous congregants on Sundays in the mid-1960s. All this began to change so that now, with the dramatic decline in vocations and church-going, combined with the sexual scandals of Western Europe and North America, one encounters a Christianity enfeebled and retreated and disoriented. A watershed shift in cultural norms and conditions has taken place. We live within, we live within a life world apart from anything that was widely imagined in the 1950s. Yet it was on its way for us, to us for centuries. The heirs of Paris, the heirs of the Enlightenment, but especially the heirs of the French Revolution, now stand critically and thoroughgoingly over against the heirs of Constantinople. They embrace commitments to a robustly secular public forum and public space within which the public media invite all to a life world structured around taken for granted expectations that are not simply post-traditional and postmodern, but which are also set against the commitments of traditional Christianity. The now dominant secular culture often has more than a moderately anti-Christian animus. Unlike Kant, who attempted to bring out of the magic hat of his rational reflections the full fabric of Christian morality regarding sexuality and death, the new postmodern Enlightenment, the commitments of the dominant culture have embedded morality instead in passionate affirmations of liberty, equality, human dignity, and human rights. I mean, it's a radical shift. For those of you all who read Kant with great joy, which I'm sure you all did, Mr. Warhardt, you stayed up, you read through the second critique in one night, correct?
Yes.
Good. If you read through Kant tries out of reason to secure every Christian commitment he had as a young pietist boy. Remember, he dies in 1804. Once you get to the 19th century, it's over. Hegel realizes it won't work. Because you don't, the question is, whose reason? I mean, there's many reasons as there are pagan gods, so you pick out the reason you want. Now, morality fragments, and there's no longer a hope to bring that all together, and there's still, for a short period of time, a belief in liberty, equality, social, human dignity, and human rights. But where do they come from? And given context, you have to pick out a particular perspective. That tree is about to fall also. But you see, what happens is one goes beyond the end of the Enlightenment with Kant, gets to the 19th century. At that point, all begins to collapse. The result is that one may have sex, reproduce, and determine the conditions of death as one wishes, as long as those decisions are made autonomously and with due respect for the liberty, human dignity, and human rights of others. This change in moral focus has supported the foundational reconstruction of the public significance of sexuality, reproduction, dying, and death, in that decisions regarding sexuality, reproduction, dying, and death have been placed within a moral discourse that gives precedence to particular senses of liberty, equality, and human dignity that not only marginalize Christian concerns, but also deflate the content of traditional morality, Christian morality itself. Autonomy, for example, becomes cardinal in a secular culture because each must, without God, choose for himself his own account of human flourishing. If there's not any particular perspective, you ask everyone in the honky-tonk, did you consent? Absent a God's eye perspective, each one then must compose an aesthetic and pleasing configuration of what he wishes to pursue. Equality becomes cardinal because without God to establish an order, each person equally asserts his own claims to respect and his own right to define the social and ontological order in which he finds himself. With each affirming his own position, the default position is that of a mutual recognition of each other's position, and therefore an affirmation of foundational equality. It's just the default position when there's no perspective to give or order. Hey, let's get along and call each other equal. I'll leave you to your own reflections if you've ever met two equal people. Finally, social justice supplants charity because being a recipient of charity humbles an equal and free person in rendering him dependent on the charitable acts of other persons. A dependency on the charitable will of another conflicts with the secular notion of human dignity. Therefore, persons are taken to have a claim to a level of support as a matter of right that is sufficient to preserve their own human dignity independently of the charitable acts of others. The secular social welfare state supplants charity with the claims of social justice grounded in a secular moral vision of equal human dignity that discourages roles that are embedded within the virtue of humility. The result is that all or nearly all other persons spheres of morality, except for commitments to autonomy, equality, human dignity, and human rights, can be subsumed under this rubric of the new culture. The watershed in morality and metaphysics was connected to this immense change in perspective. The question is, what do Christians do in response? The authentic and appropriate response to Christians, I've already suggested, should not be philosophical. One should not attempt to recapture the moral philosophical commitments that engendered the marriage of faith and reason that produced the catastrophe of our contemporary secular culture. The response should emphatically not be that ultimately the only weapon in these circumstances is the soundness of the arguments set forth in the political arena in the struggle to shape public opinion, because we don't agree about basic premises or rules of moral influence. Instead of seeking arguments to close the gap between secular ethics and religious ethics and to found an ethics of reason that goes beyond those distinctions, one probably is forced, if one wants to remain Christian, to return to the Christian responses of the first centuries. Instead of a philosophical response, there should be an embracing of the Great Commission. Christianity must reconvert Western Europe and the Americas. Values, including values for holiness set within a values discourse, are always out of context if one hopes to bring people from a secular culture. One sees this way of approaching slowly transforming Europe. And Germany, with the leading party, is the Christian Democratic Union of Angela Merkel. She never refers to Christ, but she refers to values. Her view is that if you talk about Christ, that will be divisive. When anyone reads the gospel, realize Christ said that would be really divisive. He said, I didn't come to bring peace, but a sword. So the invitation is to go to a neutral values discourse. And of course, that further strengthens the secular culture. So the point, and I'm going to try to summarize quickly so we can have a bit of a discussion and debate, was brought back then to the question raised in the Euthyphro. Will philosophy be able through its capacities to bridge us and bring us to one understanding of the good and the right or the virtuous? Or in the end, is the response of the early Christians correct? God does exist as a transcendent being, such like a black hole in the middle of the galaxy, about which nothing you can say about what's inside the black hole, but everything goes around it. The most divisive question will remain: who do you say Christ is? And who is his church? Let me thank you very much.